people who can't be here will have the opportunity to hear this. And I believe Director Kibla set up some sort of filming. I'm not sure, you'll have to ask her. The data hasn't been published yet, which is why I don't know the way out. Again, thank everybody for coming. Minister, thank you. Director Kibla's back here. The governor, thank you. All the delegates that are here. The ambassador to Palau, the United States, is on Zoom. And then, of course, we have the distinguished scientists from Harvard. We really want to look at Palau. So Dr. Ross has worked at Palau before in the Southwest Islands about 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So they came to Palau and they coordinated with the Bureau of Arts and Culture, with Director Kiblis here, to look at bones that had been previously collected. We did not dig any new skeletal material. When skeletal material is collected here in Palau in archaeological projects, it's either the owners of the material can rebury it, or if it's so ancient that we don't really know who the owners are, it's held in protective custody by the Bureau of Cultural and Historical Preservation. So we checked out which skeletal material was there, and the samples that we get a hold of, and the three places, sites that we investigated that we'll be talking about are one, the Koror quarry, which was excavated before it was quarried by myself and Henry in 2019. And then two sites in the Rock Islands. One is Omedopo. You'll know where that is. It's across from Marianas village. Omedopo is the burial cave. Am I pronouncing it right? Yeah. And the other one is Palauans, which is also called Tarzan Cave. Is where it's over there. There was a Dr. Berger came here 15 years ago and got samples from there, and so those were held. There was also a box of skeletal remains that was held with Director Pia at the Palau National Museum, and they think that those come from Keklau in Koror, but not exactly sure where. The Keklau, probably the Keklau village area, right? So those are the four sites that he'll be talking about. Those are where the remains are. Joanne is currently on island because in cooperation with the Bureau of Arts and Culture, we'll be collecting some more samples because this information is so interesting, we want to expand upon it. Okay? So, let's see. First of all, who we're talking to here are very, very important people, and they're geneticists. They're not archaeologists. Dr. Reich and Dr. Liu really wanted to present this information to you guys so that they could get your feedback, so that you could ask questions and give feedback. So there's enough time after the presentation for questions and feedback. But what I want to tell y'all is they're not archaeologists. The archaeologists are right here in the back of the room and on Zoom. So direct your questions towards the material that they're presenting. If you have questions about the archaeology, that's fine, but we can do it later. We can come to your classrooms or to your offices and discuss the archaeological permutations, okay? Because you don't want to hear me talk, you want to hear them talk. Right? The other thing is there might be, for you guys that are sensitive, I have not seen the presentation, there might be a photo of human remains. Okay, so just be prepared. It's science, and that's what we deal with. I do not know. I just want everybody to be prepared just in case. Okay, so we'll go ahead and start the presentation. I think we have to be out of here at 11:10. 11:10. So we have plenty of time after for y'all's questions and comments. They want to hear questions and comments. It's very important. Okay. Okay. So now. Dr. Reich and Dr. Liu, are you ready?
Very much looking forward to your questions and suggestions and comments about the work. The way we're going to do this presentation is I'm going to present the first half of the slides, and Yuechen Yu, who led the analysis, is going to present the second half of the slides, and we will both answer questions together. So the title of our presentation is Ancient DNA Reveals Deep Population Mixture in Palau. And there are a number of people who work together on this project, but Joanne Eakin, who is with you today and has traveled to be at this meeting, for example, is a key member. Rosalind Hunter-Anderson, Jolie, who's also here today, and others have contributed. Yuechen, can you move to the next slide, please? So here is a picture of a human bone, not from Palau, but from another place in the world. It's a bone from the side of the skull containing the inner ear region, and it is the richest source of DNA that is known from ancient remains. So DNA, as you probably all know, is the genetic code. It is a long string of about 3 billion DNA letters. There are 4 DNA letters: adenine, cytosine, guanine, thymine, ACGT. And DNA sequencers can read out those letters from a sample taken from your blood or from your spit. And what was really amazing was, beginning in 2010, it was realized that we could also read out DNA sequences from bones from people who lived a long time ago, thousands of years ago, or sometimes even tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years ago, sometimes even in very warm conditions such as in Palau. So we usually try to study this petrous bone, which is the richest source of DNA in the body. And in our laboratory, we have a clean room. The goal is to protect the sample from people handling the sample. And so this is one of the technicians in our clean room. And then we get beneath the surface of the sample to take out a particularly DNA-rich part, this is the cochlea, the organ of hearing. We take a little bit of a powder from this. It's very small. It's about 1/40th of the weight of a paperclip. And then we dissolve the powder in a watery solution that extracts the DNA and removes the bone calcium and the minerals and the protein. And then we turn it into a form that can be sequenced. That means we can read out the DNA letters in one of these modern sequencers that began to be available about 15 years ago. And these sequencers have really dropped the cost of sequencing by more than 1 million times. And because they've dropped the cost of sequencing so much, it begins to be possible to get DNA out of these very old remains where the DNA is short and fragmented and also has microbial contamination from the bacteria that got into people's remains after they died. Next slide, please. So to just give you a flavor of the increase in the amount of data of this type that has happened, the first whole genome sequences were published in 2010, 4 of them from archaic humans, from groups of people who no longer live today, one from someone who lived in Siberia about 60 or 70,000 years ago, 3 Neanderthals, who are archaic humans who lived in Europe maybe 50,000 years ago, and 1 Greenlander who lived about 4,000 years ago. And then the next 4 or 5 years, there were maybe 10 sequences from different people every year, very important ones, and we learned tremendous things from them. And each of these genome sequences came from careful work with samples, working on them, until we found one that worked. The next phase that happened is we used a strategy of taking these samples from ancient DNA and enriching them for places in the DNA that we knew provided information about the past. So the problem with ancient DNA sequences is, as I said, there is microbial contamination. Only a tiny fraction of the sequences we analyzed are really from the person whose bone it was. Many of them are from the bacteria who entered their bones after they died. And so it's very costly to sequence these samples, even with these inexpensive sequencing technologies. So what we did is we took the DNA samples and washed them over molecules that fished out the sequences that we were interested in, just sort of like baits are used to fish out fish from the water. And this made the sequencing about 30 times less expensive and made it possible to go up from maybe 10 samples a year to maybe a few hundred samples per year. And then what happened is there was a roboticization of the process where we use robots where we can process about 90 samples at the same time. And this has resulted in thousands of new individuals with genome scale data. So in just a little bit more than 10 years, we now have data for more than 10,000 individuals with genome scale data. And this makes it possible to ask how people in the past relate to each other and to people today. This was simply not possible before. We were trapped in the present and simply had to compare living people to each other. Now we can compare living people to people who lived in the past thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of years ago. It's really a miracle that we're able to do this, and it's really a miracle that the DNA is preserved so well that we can get a readout really in many ways as good for many of these individuals, including the ones from Palau that we'll talk about in Reich and I. That's as good as almost what you could get from taking a blood sample from a person today. Next slide, please. So I'm going to just give you a background you don't need to know. So this is a map of Palau, both in its broader context in the Western Pacific area, and also blown up to be more visible with the labels of the locations from which we obtained data. Here's a chronology of archaeological reconstruction of human presence in Palau. And I think there's different ways of doing this categorization, but perhaps one could categorize it into these 4 periods of time where BP means years before present. Palau is very special in many ways, but one of them is that it's one of the very first places in remote Oceania to be peopled. There have been people in places like New Guinea or the Philippines or Australia for 40,000 years or more, also in Solomon Islands and Britain, which are archipelagos to the east of New Guinea for many tens of thousands of years. But Palau and the Southwest Pacific Islands beyond and Micronesia did not have people until about 3,000 years ago. And the very first people came to Palau, to the Marianas archipelago, and to Southwest Pacific Islands like Vanuatu and New Caledonia. Next slide, please. So we have been very intensely engaged in our work group in trying to learn from ancient DNA about the relationships of the first people in the remote Oceania and how people related to each other and to people in near Oceania. We published our first paper on this in 2015, focusing on 4 individuals from Vanuatu and from Fiji in the Southwest Pacific. We have data from people from 3,000 to 2,500 years ago. Amazing data. And the data that we had, Yue Shen will talk with you a little bit about it in a little bit, was a real shock. So today, the people in Vanuatu are 90% on average of the DNA comes from ancestors who lived in New Britain and New Guinea, places like that. But the first people were almost entirely East Asian in origin, related to people, for example, in some parts of the Philippines or Taiwan or the mainland, like places like China. So this was a huge shock because it meant that the very first people who arrived in Vanuatu were ancestrally, at most, contributing only 10% of the people who live there today. And there must have been not only this initial peopling event around 3,000 years ago, around the same time as the first peopling of Palau, but also later movements of people from New Britain, which is this east archipelago to the east of New Guinea. So, also, in a series of subsequent papers, we did a lot more work on Vanuatu with later individuals. We documented when these New Guinea-like ancestry arrived, and that was after about 2,500 years ago. And we have a whole beautiful time sequence and series documenting the transitions in ancestry in Vanuatu. We know so much that we didn't know before. With Rosalind and Joanne and others, we also did a study a couple of years ago that was mentioned about population history in one of the other of the 3 places first to be peopled, the Marianas archipelago, including Guam and Saipan. And here again, the first people are from around 3,000 years ago, and here again we have a time series. The history is in some ways similar, but in some ways very different. the first people have, again, almost entirely East Asian ancestry with no Papuan ancestry or very little. And today that's actually also true. There's very little or no Papuan ancestry. That's quite different from the Southwest Pacific. But there was a later movement of people, and we found in that paper that the movement of people was from a people that is just related more than anybody else we sampled to people living today in Palau. So that was the first evidence that there was something special and unique about Palau. A population related to Palauans is the source of the migration that happened later, within the last 1,000 or so years, affecting people in Guam and Saipan. So the other work that we did in Micronesia documented a minimum of 5 streams of migration from near Oceania, the places that had been settled a long time before, to remote Oceania. 3 of those streams of migration were this East Asian ancestry related type. What I said before is related to people in the Philippines and to Taiwan mainland. Related to the first people who arrived in Vanuatu. We call these first remote Oceanians. And you see at the top, first remote Oceanian Southwest Pacific. And also in the Marianas, there's a related group of people, closely related, and we call them first remote Oceanians Marianas. And we didn't have any ancient DNA from Palau, but from reconstructing from modern Palauans and from the hint of similar data through migration in the Marianas, we hypothesized that there was a third lineage, and we called it in this other paper, first remote Oceanian Palau. So 3 streams of migration, and they mix with 2 different streams of migration coming from the southwest, from New Guinea. One of them is related to mainland New Guinea, and one of them is related to the Bismarck Archipelago, New Britain. The Bismarck Archipelago, New Britain is the one that could mix with first remote Oceania and Southwest Pacific and form the ancestry of present-day people. But people in central Micronesia, places like Chuk and Pompi, have a different type of Papuan ancestry that comes in after about 2,500 years ago into their ancestors. And it's not from New Britain, it's from mainland New Guinea. And also Palauans, we've reconstructed from present-day Palauans, also have a mixture of mainland New Guinean ancestry and first remote Oceanian Palau. So it's very complicated and very interesting, with a pattern of this first remote Oceanian spread, combined with streams of different types of Papuan ancestry happening at least in the Southwest Pacific, places like Vanuatu later, but we didn't know in Palau. Palau is one of the first 3 places of the remote Oceania to be peopled. It has a unique type of first remote Oceanian ancestry. It's reconstructed from present-day people. And also linguistically, it's very unique and special because it's one of the first branching orders of the radiation of a major branch of Austronesian languages. The one in Marianas, like Chamorro languages, is another of those first branches, and another is all other oceanic languages. So linguistically, Palau is also very distinctive, and archaeologically it's also early and very distinctive. So that made it super important in order to learn more, to study what the genetics was in Palau, and to what extent it was similar to, and to what extent the patterns were different from what we had data from in the Marianas Archipelago, in central Micronesia, and also in the Southwest Pacific. Now I'm going to go take the turn over to Wei Chen Liu, who is the population geneticist who I work with, who has led the statistical work. He will talk for about as much time as I did, and then we will answer the questions together.
Hi everyone. Thanks, David. And as David says, in our previous work, we know that what's the genetic ancestry in present-day Palau. So in this particular study, the very natural question that we want to ask first here is, are the genetic ancestry of ancient Palau similar or different with the modern ones? So thanks to our colleagues and some of them on this Zoom, we fortunately collect 37 samples from Palau. These 37 individuals live in Palau between 2,600 BP to 1,300 BP. And from these 37 samples, we successfully got ancient DNA data from 17 of them. This is all the data that we have for analysis. So after we got ancient DNA data, we can map the reads, map the sequence data to the human reference genome. Based on the mapping result, we can determine whether they are male or female person, and we can know how many SNPs, it means how many variants on autosome they for each individual compared to the human reference genome. And then we can know what's the difference of each individual's mitochondrial genome compared to the human reference genome, and also the Y chromosome haplotype. So you can see here, for each individual, we have a many number of variants in the autosomes, and some of them have very good quality data, especially for this one. This is the sorry about my pronunciation, is Euphenius. Is that right for my pronunciation? But this is a very important samples, is that they have very good quality data, and also they have a very old radiocarbon dates. It's about, after calibration, it's about 2,600 BP. And another interesting information that we can learn from this spreadsheet is that for this mitochondrial genome, you can see there's different types of mitochondrial haplotype. For the B group, E group, and also for the B group and E group, they are very common in East Asian population. But for the P group, it's very common in the Papuan population. This gives us a very first hypothesis that if the earliest people from Palau carries any Papuan ancestry. So we got to learn this, so we did our analysis. This is the first analysis that we done for to understand the genetic population structure of this ancient Palauans. So the basic idea of this analysis is that we compare the Palauans, both the ancient ones and present ones, with all the other individuals that we have data from the Pacific Islanders. So the basic orientation of this figure is that in this side, in the left side is the Papuan ancestry population, and in the right side is the East Asian ancestry population. Well, in the upwards is some people from the South Island, which is carry a unique lineage of Papuan ancestry, and in the bottom is the New Guinea population, which is carry another kind of unique Papuan ancestry. So you can see here in this figure, I draw some of the dashed line, which means we call it genetic line. So what's the genetic line mean? So if you can imagine some of the population is derived the same two sources, the same two ancestral population. But this upstream population carry different proportions of ancestry from each ancestors. So you will see there is some variables in ratio of their ancestry come from each ancestral population. So this scenario in this figure will be the population along each cline. So you can see here, there is a blue line which links on the left side, there is Bantling from New Britain, which carry almost 100% of Papuan ancestry, while on the other side, it links some East Asian population. And this dark blue and light blue is some population from Polynesia and also from the New Britain. And this purple one is the population from Vanuatu. It means that the population from Vanuatu and Polynesia carry the same sources of Papuan ancestry and East Asian ancestry. Well, there is also another cline in the bottom, which links some population from mainland New Guinea to the coastal New Guinea. And also these points are the data that we got from Palau, including the present ones and ancient ones, and also links some people from the central Micronesia, including the Truk and Pohnpei. The very basic idea or the knowledge that we can get from this figure is that you can see all ancient individuals from Palau clustered together very closely with the present ones. So we can know that ancient Palauans are closely related to present-day Palauans, which means the ancient people are very similar to the present-day people. So this is another way to understand this. The difference of this figure compared to the previous one, the major difference is that each point here represents a different population. So this slide is also explain the genetic relationship between the Vanuatu population and the Polynesian population. And this slide explains also the New Guinea population, some from the mainland New Guinea, some from the coastal New Guinea. And these are the data that we got from Palau. This is I divided into 4 populations, four ancient populations. I mean, the data from 4 sites, so I didn't, I divided them into 4 populations and also the present Palau, the cluster together. And also tells us, a different method also tells us the ancient Palauans are very similar to the present Palauans. This is the central Micronesian population from Truk and Pompeii. They also cluster together, means that they are also very genetically similar. So after we know that the ancient Palauans is very similar to the present Palauans, the next question we want to ask is that what's the proportions of the genetic ancestry in this Palauans people? So we estimate the proportions of East Asian ancestry and Papuan ancestry of this ancient and present-day Palau people. So you can see basically the percentage of the different ancestry components is very similar when we compare the ancient people to the present people. Although you can learn from this figure that the earliest people from Palau carried more, slightly but significantly more Papuan ancestry compared to the later people, especially compared to the present-day Palauans. This information tells us that this is probably because there is a continuous migration from into Palau. So it results that the present-day Palauans have more East Asian ancestry and less Papuan ancestry, which is very different from the observation that we learned from Vanuatu. This is a recent work that we published a few years ago from our lab. We learned a beautiful time series from Vanuatu, and you can see here the earliest people in Vanuatu has a 100% East Asian ancestry. Well, after 2500 BP, the Vanuatu people began to have a large percent of Papuan ancestry. But if you plot all the Palau data that we have on this figure, so all these 5 points will be around this 40% line. It's the Papuan ancestry percentage. So it's very different from the observation that we learned from the Vanuatu in Southwest Pacific. The next question that we want to ask in this particular study is that after we know that how many percentage of each kind of genetic component, genetic ancestry component in Palau people, we want to know when this admixture event happened. So we do an estimate. We do an estimate of when this admixture event happened. We now know that all the Palauan people carry kind of East Asian ancestry and Papuan ancestry. So we learn when this admixture event happened. This estimate is a generation before the people, the time of the people living in Palau. You can imagine these people, the earliest people lived in Palau, we have the recorded dates is about 2600 BP. So if the admixture time happened 35 generations before, and we assume like each generation is about 27 to 30 years, so we can have a very old estimation of the admixture time. BP of when this mixture time happened. When we compare the mixture time of all the other populations in the Pacific, you can see this time is very old. It's much older than any other place in the Pacific Island. This is Vanuatu in the Southwest Pacific. This is Solomon Island in the near Oceania. This is Polynesia, like Tonga, Samoa, and New Ireland in near Oceania, New Guinea, New Britain, also in near Oceania. This is Micronesia samples, and all of our Palau populations is kind of older. The amateur time is kind of older than all the other populations that we have data from Micronesia. And another interesting thing we can learn from this figure is that this R is the initial arrival period of Palau. It's between 3,100 BP to 2,700 BP. And the amateur time to estimate for the earliest people from Palau is earlier than the initial arrival period of Palau. So we can know that Palau, and especially the usual sites are very unique in Oceania, and now we know that perhaps before these earliest people arriving in Palau, they are already a mix. This is amazing that when we learn this from our data, we are shocked because this is very different from all the other places that we observed in Oceania. So after we know when this unusual events happen, the next question that we want to ask is where this unusual event happened. So we do a search for all the ancient data that we have from the published data set, and also there is some ancient data from the eastern part of Asia, the Maritime Islands, that these people from the same two sources with the ancient Palau people. So there's a genetic model. You can see the Palau people have about 60% East Asian ancestry and 40% of the Papua ancestry, while the Maritime people from the eastern Indonesia has about 67% of East Asian ancestry and 33% of the Papua ancestry. So this means that some people from the Maritime Islands, we do not have data, but probably there are some earlier people from the Maritime Islands are the ancestor of the ancient Palauans. Or we can say that some people from this place arrived Palau first. So but we can see because we also estimate that the mixture date of these people. This is earlier. The mixture date of these people is, much younger than we estimate from the ancient Palau. It means that there is continuous East Asian ancestry come from maybe from Philippines or other places of Southeast Asia to the Maritime Islands, which is similar of the observation that we learned from the later Palau people, like from Koror, or Palau, or Amendoko, or present-day Palau people. So, to give you a very brief summary of our study, we have got some amazing results when we compare the ancient Palauans to present Palauans. We know that all ancient individuals were mixed with East Asian ancestry and Papua ancestry, and their percentage of this ancestral component is very similar to present-day people. And we learned that the Papua ancestry at all these sites of Palau is higher than the later people from Palau. And we learned that a mixture event between Papua ancestry and East Asian ancestry happened for these earlier Palau people began at least 3,200 years ago, which means that before the people arrived at Palau, a mixture events already happened. And we assume that this mixture event probably happened in East Asia, east part of Indonesia. So the pattern that we observed in Palau is very different from all the other places in the Pacific Island, as David has mentioned before in his introduction. For example, in Vanuatu, we know that there is a very clear that at least two phases or two streams of migration. The first one is totally East Asian related, and the second stream of migration is Papuan related. So you can see the earliest people in Vanuatu is 100% East Asian ancestry, and later Vanuatu has both East Asian and Papuan ancestry. But in Palau, we know that the earliest people from Palau and also the later people from Palau, all of them carry both East Asian and Papuan ancestry, and they have very similar percentage of each ancestral components. So this is the major findings of our result. So the most striking finding is that we know that the mixture event of East Asian ancestry and Papuan ancestry in Palau happened before the arrival of the first people in Palau. So thank you everyone for listening, and David and I and also our other colleagues are happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Can we turn on the lights so I can... That was a lot, right, guys? Okay, but you got it, right? Questions or comments from Dr. Liu or Dr. Reich, or do you need to like digest this? Question. Can you get a test now? I want to know my DNA test.
That's my question. Can you do a DNA test?
Could someone repeat the question, because we're not very close to the microphone, so we're not picking up all the sounds.
Can you do a DNA test from us?
Yeah. We're the same people for the... Yeah, not today.
The question, I think, was, are we able to do a DNA test from people, for example, volunteers today, for example, or in the room? I think that would be a wonderful thing to be able to do. We don't have in our laboratory a approved protocol that allows us to collect sort of DNA or samples from present-day people. We'd have to go through a university protocol to allow us to do that. But that would be a wonderful thing to do. So maybe that's something that could be planned in the future.
Talk really loud in the mic, you guys.
Thank you. So the science proves what our oral history and what we know from our stories from our elders. Morotai is nothing new to us when we hear Morotai. So I guess it rings true, right? The stories that we hear from our parents, grandparents, of our ancestors. Thank you.
Did you hear that, Dr. Wright?
Yes, we heard that.
You have samples from 4 different sites. 3 of them seems to be from Koror and the Rock Islands around Koror, with one set, only one set from Babeldoab Island, the Big Island. I guess there's 2 things. The older set of genetics are coming from Koror side, the southern side of the island. And then the older one is, and the younger one is coming from Palau, or maybe that's from the northern side. The question is, you're saying, are those samples really, given only 4 sets of samples, could we really say that those really represent the population of Palau? Or do you think we could genetics results could change that? Or is that pretty much conclusive?
That's an excellent question, and I actually think we have a manuscript draft that I think actually I would suggest that we talk amongst our collaborating team and actually think about adding a comment on that very point about whether the sampling we have currently is really an adequate representation of ancient Palau. Because I don't think it is. I think that we can say some things based on it, and we can't say other things. So what we can say is we have individuals who come from a range of times, over actually quite a long range of times, from maybe 1,600 years ago to maybe 2,600 years ago or something like that. And all of them are genetically very similar to each other, and they're from somewhat diverse places in the area. And the fact that they're genetically so similar to each other makes us guess that maybe additional sites, there's a good chance they would be genetically similar. But of course, we don't have samples from some of the other earlier sites. We don't have the geography fully covered at all times. And you can't generalize always from a small numbers of samples. What we can say is that the DNA data from the times that we've sampled has the characteristics we found. So for example, for the oldest site, this one, which dates to about 2,600 years or 2,700 years ago, in that site, the individuals seem to have DNA that arises from mixture that happened 1,000 years before they lived. And so, because the archaeology of Palau suggests that people didn't come to Palau until after that time, what it suggests is that the mixing together of Papuan and East Asian related ancestry components happened, at least in part, not in Palau itself, but in the source populations that brought people to Palau. So we can say that at least for some people that we have data from, we have a pattern not seen anywhere else in remote Oceania, where we can see that the first migrants were not entirely East Asian ancestry, but in fact had large amounts of Papuan ancestry arising from earlier interactions. That's a big shock to us. It's very unique. And so while it's quite possible that additional samples would show a different pattern, similar maybe to what you see in the Marianas or to Vanuatu, we know that for these individuals, at least, this is the pattern, and so it would have been, even if we find that, we would know that it's variable. It's quite possible that actually there could be a lineage that doesn't have Papuan mixture. Why? Because as I said earlier in my part of the talk, in the Marianas, we find evidence later on of gene flow, migration, from a lineage related to what you see in Palau into the Marianas, mixing in maybe 20% if I remember, to what you see in Reich earlier in the Marianas. If that had already had Papuan ancestry, it would have brought Papuan ancestry into the Marianas, but we don't see that. So that suggests there's a Palau-related lineage that's unsampled, and a good guess is that it's in Palau somewhere that we haven't sampled. So that would be consistent with your findings, and studying additional remains from other sites might allow us to see that if it occurred. It could also be from somewhere else that we haven't sampled. Thank you.
If I may, just another possible follow-up. So there's archaeological work going on with terraces in Palau, and right now they're estimating that those structures were constructed around 2000 BP or earlier than that. Could it be possible that there were people here way before that? Maybe, the findings you have show that there were mixed ancestry already in Palau around 3000 BP. But could the population have been here way before that? Given that there are structures that are as old as, almost as old as those genetics.
Maybe a comment in reply is, that's not a question that the genetic data we have can answer. That's an archaeological question. So the genetics can tell us what the DNAs and the DNA of the people we sampled. The DNA of the people we sampled lived from about 1,600 years ago to about 2,600 years ago and had the ancestry that it did. So we don't know how the mix of ancestries present in those people got there, and we don't know where they lived. I am not aware of compelling archaeological evidence of people living in Palau before 3,200 BP, but if there were, this would not be the genetics to discover that. That would be from the archaeological evidence. And of course, for example, if we did find that there was archaeological evidence of people living in Palau, say 4,000 BP or earlier than 3,500 BP, that would be phenomenally interesting, and it would raise the possibility again that possibly the mixture could have occurred on Palau itself. But even so, it would be very different from the pattern seen in, for example, the Southwest Pacific, where the mixture happens much later.
Good morning, Dr. Reich. I'm listening to you, and I must say I want to thank you, and I appreciate your work. And in 2018, there was a conference in Palau about the origin of the Austronesian people, and experts all over the Pacific came and gave talks, and they indicate that the Palauans are about 3,000-year-old people, and we came from southern China to Taiwan for about 1,000 years, and then came to Palau for 3,000 years since then. So I personally asked them, what are the basis of your conclusion? And they told me at that time that it was based on language and music, on the archaeological studies, and also on the current and the wind trend. So it appears that your study has verified and proved that where we came from. So when can you reach the conclusion that given the studies we made, that we did come from Asia originally, and also with the mixture from Papua and New Guinea area?
Sorry, is the question, I think I missed one sentence of your question, which is very interesting. I think the sentence was, are you asking whether these results, how they relate to theories about, spread out of Taiwan and Austronesian languages?
Yeah, basically the conclusion of that conference I was in is that the Austronesian people came from China, originally to Taiwan, spread here. But the Papua people and then the Australian Aborigines are older people. So my question is that with your studies up to now, can you make a conclusion that we are as what your studies show is appears to be prove what the professors and the people who were invited to the conference taught us. So how far are you to reaching the conclusion that yes, this is our migration around people, this is where we came from?
So that's very helpful. So I, to be honest, this paper leaves me feeling that the history is more complicated than I had assumed before. So the history before guessed that the history of Palau would be very similar to the history of the Marianas and the Southwest Pacific, the two other places in the Pacific first to be peopled. My prediction at this point was that the first people in all three places would be entirely East Asian in ancestry, related, they would be this first remote Oceanian group that we mentioned, and that those groups, we already know from the genetic data, are indeed related to people from Taiwan. And Taiwan is also where the language is closest to the languages spoken in Palau and the Marianas and the Pacific and many parts of Indonesia are, and are more diverse. So the linguistic reconstruction seemed to match the genetic data that the first spread was from this region, and the findings seemed about right. So that was what I thought would happen. But when we have the data from Palau, it looks like that simple story is not right for Palau. That is, the Palauan first remote Oceanian ancestry arrives in Palau already mixed with mainland New Guinean ancestry, and in fact were mixed quite a long time before. So that doesn't coincide with this simple model of an unmixed East Asian population coming from Taiwan via the Philippines and not mixing with the people that come along the way. It instead suggests that they interacted with the people that they came and that were there already, and that it's all, at least in Palau, it's this mixed population that's at least part of the first spread of people. So I'm not fundamentally challenging, or in this research, certainly not that linguistic reconstruction, and also not challenging, the importance of the initial spreads from Taiwan and the Philippines. But I think will be seen as complicating the story and identifying a more complicated set of sources that is more in island Southeast Asia and not all coming from mainland immediately and initially and simply. Does that make sense as an answer? At least from the demographic and biological point of view. One of the things we're doing right now is that we're obtaining additional dates. The very old reconstructed mixture between Papuan and East Asian ancestry is so old that it's before, for example, in the Southwest Pacific, the Lapita archaeological complex appearance, for example. It's quite surprising, so we're trying to get additional radiocarbon dates from additional samples from the sites for which we have data. We're trying to redate the same sample just because that data is so old that we really would like to be sure of it in order to publish these results.
I have a question. If we have had a DNA test, like from 23andMe, would you be able to use that data in your study?
It's the right kind of data. Again, like my university is very constraining, so we're not allowed to take data in from people who are identified. They just don't allow us to do that, so we need a protocol to do that. I actually collaborate closely with the former postdoctoral scientist of a graduate student in my laboratory who is now employed by 23andMe. And we actually have been working with them, so one thing that we often do is we can ask them to work with 23andMe customers, and they have a method now to compare them to ancient DNA data for free. They don't charge anything. But that might be a mechanism you could use. We published a year or two ago a paper on my country on African Americans, enslaved African Americans who were buried in the United States in the state of Maryland, where I actually grew up, about 200 years ago. And we got DNA from 27 of them, and we compared them to people who had in the 23andMe data set. And so that mechanism is actually very interesting, and it's well worked out, and it's something that's possible to do.
Here's a question here, and thank you for the presentation. I'm curious to see our similarity to the other Micronesian regions, and if you can just help to explain or articulate again what the Palauan lineage in the Marianas had mentioned that there is that. If you could just kind of highlight that again so it's clearer.
Ken, would you like to take that question?
Yes. Actually, in our previous work, and also this particular study, that we know that Palau people and also the other place from Central Micronesia, like Truk and Pompeii, they all their ancestry are all mixed. They both carry East Asian ancestry and Papuan ancestry. And we know that Papuan ancestry we found in the Palau people and also the Truk and Pompeii, they come from most likely from the same ancestral population on this unmarked island in northern part of New Guinea. But we learned that East Asian of ancestry in Palau and Truk and Pompeii are different. Truk and Pompeii carry East Asian ancestry and more Lapita-like, which also have been seen in Vanuatu Island. But the lineage East Asian ancestry that David has mentioned is very early migration. And this East Asian ancestry in Palau, we also seen in Mariana Islands in the Herbal from the Unai period in Guam and also the Lati period in Guam and Saipan. Then there is an error. We do not see the Palau like East Asian ancestry in the Unai period in Guam, but we do see the Palau like East Asian ancestry in the Lati period people in Guam and Saipan. So this is the link, or this is the relationship between ancestry in Pompeii and Marianas. And the Marianas Islands is one of the almost the only one that people, we do not see any Papuan ancestry, even in the present day, people living there. So the earliest people in Guam is 100% of the East Asian ancestry. The kind of East Asian ancestry we call here is first the Remote Oceania Marianas. And the Lati period people, we got data from Guam and Saipan. They have two kinds of East Asians. One is the earliest East Asian ancestry, like first Remote Oceania Marianas, and the other kind of East Asian ancestry, we call it first Remote Oceania Palau. This is the general pattern that we learned from our study. And in this particular study, we know that the earlier people, the ancient people living in Palau, are very similar to the present people that we learned from in previous studies. Yeah.
Dr. Lilly, just to make that a little bit clearer so I can understand. So you're saying that a group of people that were living in Palau that had Papuan ancestry, then a large group moved into the Marianas. And part of the Marianas population is populated by people that came from Palau at one time. Is that correct?
Sorry.
Please, David, go ahead.
It's a confusing result and very interesting. So I think it's quite possible, that's possible, and suggested in some ways by the data, but in other aspects of the data suggest something different might be happening. What we're seeing is that close to half of the DNA of people in Palau, a little bit more than half, is from this lineage, from this ancestry that arrives also in the Marianas in Guam. So but it arrives in Guam without the other type of ancestry that's present in all the Palauans we studied, including present-day Palauans. So about 40% of the Palauan ancestry is Papuan. We don't see that arrive in Guam. So if it was like the people that we sampled from 4 sites, as well as modern Palauans, you might think that there should be Papuan ancestry arriving in Guam too, but we don't see that. So maybe, as a questioner asked before, there's another area within Palau that doesn't have Papuan ancestry. Or alternatively, maybe we're seeing some other deep branching source of ancestry related to the one that mixed with Papuans in Palau, maybe not on Palau itself, coming into the Marianas. So it's a mystery. It's one of the reasons that more ancient DNA sampling is important. And we also see those components coming together, in the Morotai Islands, for example. So it's all very interesting, and it's a new frontier of research. One of the things that we didn't talk about is that in Wei Chen's previous paper, if you look at the relationship between these three first remote Oceanian lineages, the one in Marianas, the one in Southwest Pacific, places like Vanuatu, and the one in Palau. Palau is the first splitting one. It's the earliest one. It's the earliest branch. The other two are more closely related to each other than either is to the one in Palau. So it suggests an earlier process, an earlier event that leads to this lineage. That would be consistent with the mixture happening earlier with Palauans than in the other places. So it's just very exciting and new. That's all. We don't know all the answers. We found some new things out. They were actually quite surprising, and they raised new questions.
There's a question from this place over here. When you studied the modern Palauans, when was the year that you studied the modern Palauans?
Chad, do you have the date of the origin of the sample set that we analyzed?
The data that you mean the data that we got present day, it's around 2021, I think. Around that time. We start our previous work on Micronesian things 2020, and I think in 2021 we got the present day data from her. Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. So my question now goes to the other present DNAs that you can probably find in the archaeological sites, which would be the fish bones and other bones, and as well as residues from taro or other plants. How can you apply similar investigation with those samples, or is that something that we can't do? Partially because I'm interested in the material cultures as well as behaviors and cultural exchange.
We can get DNA from fish, and the fact that we're getting preservation in humans means that why not? Why can't we? We have a study that we're doing collaboratively in Spain where we're working on salmon in Iberia, and we have DNA working for 18,000-year-old fish, and over time in a particular part of Spain. So it's a thing that one could do to try to understand changes in the nature of the populations of different animals over time. Bone is an amazing material for preservation of DNA. It's kind of a miracle that it preserves DNA, and it's not all tissues and not all biological types of tissue preserve DNA. So as a really surprising example of this, if you look at Egyptian mummies, which are so well preserved, the DNA seems to be very, very badly preserved. But somehow the bones in graves are actually very well preserved, and people now think it's something to do with the mineral content of the bones being a good substance to stick and preserve DNA when the cells break up. So there's been relatively little good work, in my opinion, on old plant DNA. But there are some types of plants that do have hard materials that preserve for a long time. So for example, maize has been used, and the corn cobs preserved for a long time, and some of the seeds of some other plants, like grape seeds, have been used for thousands of years of study. I'm not an expert in this, but I've read some of these papers, and I think it's very interesting.
Thank you, Director Giblas and Drs. Reich, Liu, and Dr. Liston. Very interesting presentation. I noted the ancient history or DNA of Palauans, as you had shown, shows a higher percentage of the East Asian versus the Papuan. It would be interesting, I mean, I'd like that the students can see how unique Palau is in language and be more patriotic, but it'd be interesting to see if you can do a study of the DNA between these dates that you've done and before we got our TT passport. When was that, Moses, 1981? I'd like to see how colonization has affected the population. And it would be interesting to see the DNA with how the Spaniards, the Germans, the Japanese, the Americans have kind of influenced also the identity of a Palauan. Would that be possible?
That's definitely something that would be fascinating to do, to understand the present-day diversity in Palau. And it's something that modern methods would be able to do extremely well. The data that we have from modern-day Palauans happens to be from people whose ancestors were not from the colonization. But if you could get a cross-section of the population, you could do these studies. The work we did in the Marianas of modern people from Guam was very strongly affected by the colonial period. What we saw was DNA that was affected, probably, that even had Native American DNA, probably brought through the Philippines, through the Spanish, moving people back and forth across the Pacific, through what's known as the Manila Galleon trade. And that had mixed with the local Mariana population, and we could, with our ancient DNA, we could sort of see what was as a result of the colonization, what was the prior type of ancestry, but most of it was the prior type of ancestry. It would be very interesting to do a similar study in Palau.
Thank you very much for that very fascinating, informative presentation. My takeaway from your findings is that the Palauan population has demonstrated resilience over thousands of years. Moving forward, the next few thousands of years, as a geneticist, what would you recommend? If you had an opportunity to do further studies and research in Palau, which field or sector would you want to collaborate with? We've discovered this data with your collaboration with archaeology. What might that be if you collaborated with health in terms of our genetic composition moving forward? Thank you.
I think the question was in terms of health. Is that the question?
Yes.
Medicine and health?
Yes.
That is another great interest I have. I didn't talk about it, but the history of each population affects its risk for different conditions. And I think that a careful study of the history of each population is important in order to understand the particular disease susceptibilities that are particular to that population. I don't know anything about what are the issues that are specifically going to affect people of Palau. As an example of this, one study that my colleagues and I did focused on many groups within India, South Asia, and we studied almost 300 different ethnic groups in India, and what we found was that about 1/3 of those groups went through very severe founder events where relatively small numbers of people then grew in population and contributed to to populations today. And when that happens, people are at risk for diseases that were rare diseases that were present in one copy of the DNA in those founding people, and then got increased in frequency because they had so many children over so many generations. And that means that different groups are susceptible for different diseases, and the only way to learn about that is to carry out a focused study of that population. Just today, a very intensive and powerful and rich study was just published on the population history of the very large island of Greenland in the North Atlantic. It studied a very large fraction of the people who live in Greenland, 6,000 people. There's only 60,000 or so people on the whole island. And it found all of these risk factors for medical conditions that affect people in Greenland more than other people. So I think it could be something you could think about to explore whether medical research using modern DNA sequencing methods could characterize the particular risk for diseases that would be likely present in the population. Another thing that's relevant to that, of course, is understanding the history of mixture in the population. Palauans we seem to be today a result of mixture of about 40% Papuan and about 60% East Asian ancestry. Those two populations would have each had their own risk factors for different conditions, and it's important to understand that in order to understand risk in the population. Palau is not alone in being mixed. Every single population in the world is the result of layers and layers of mixtures of very different groups, each one different. But again and again, what DNA and ancient DNA is showing us is that there are no pure people. People are just the result of layer and layer and layer of mixture and migration. And I think it's important to understand the history of each group in order to maximally benefit that group.
Thank you very much.
Are there any more questions out there? We have this opportunity, it's slipping through our fingers here. Everybody good? Dr. Reich and Dr. Liu, thank you so much for your time and the energy that you've spent studying Palau. We all appreciate it very, very much. Thank you.